The battle for eastern Ukraine hits a critical moment. Officials are desperately trying to get civilians out of the Donbas region as Russian ground forces push forward. Joining us now is Brian Clark. He's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. Brian, thanks so much for being with us. What do we know about Russia's emerging military strategy in the East as we enter what appears to be this sort of new phase of the conflict?
Yeah, Jim, what they're looking at trying to do is consolidate the gains that they've been making in the East over the last decade. Ever since the annexation of Crimea, Russian forces have been mounting this gray zone operation in the East in Luhansk and Donetsk to try to take that territory and make it essentially independent from Ukraine. Russian forces have been doing this under the cloak of paramilitary groups, non-uniformed troops, but now they're transitioning that to this armed conflict, and they're taking all those units that were previously up in the north, moving them to the south, and forcing them to go and occupy the eastern part of Ukraine. So by essentially this pincher move of forces coming from the north and the west and forces continuing to come from the east, they're attempting to gain complete control of the Donbas and be able to solidify that control. They would like to also have a land bridge over to Crimea so that they're able to move between Russia proper and then Russian Crimea without having to transition through Ukrainian territory.
And so, Brian, if Russia does take control of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, will that be enough for President Putin, or will he continue to push this conflict further?
It probably won't be enough. Like we saw in Chechnya, he'll consolidate these gains and then maybe pause until forces can be reconstituted. They can get a new crop of recruits in because they depend quite a bit on conscript forces, and then maybe mount a new offensive to try to take the rest of Ukraine perhaps later in this year or early next year. So I could see this just being part of a longer, protracted conflict with Ukraine, which Russia has mounted against Georgia and in its own territory against Chechnya.
Okay, but as we sort of enter what we're talking about as this new chapter, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about what does a win for President Zelensky look like, apart from the obvious full removal of Russian troops from Ukraine. How do you define a win right now?
I think surviving this part of the conflict and keeping access to the Black Sea is going to be a win for Zelensky, because if you can get the Russians to pause with their gains in the Donbas becomes essentially a semi-autonomous region, more or less under Russian control. But Ukraine still has Odessa and access to the Black Sea for economic reasons. That would be a win, because now Ukraine could reconstitute its economy, build back its infrastructure, rebuild its military with Western assistance, and maybe pursue EU membership. So there's a lot of paths forward for Ukraine if they continue to have that western part of the country, Kyiv, all the way down to Odessa, even if the eastern part is cleaved off.
Sometimes survival, just survival, is a win. Brian Clark, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Tanya.